Vitor had always known that lying could be a powerful tool, but he never imagined how far it could take him. When he entered the world of politics, he believed that things followed a natural path of respect and honesty, but he soon realized how flawed the promises he made were, the truths never told. Over time, he learned the art of manipulating information, distorting facts, and creating a narrative that favored his own interests. At first, he told himself that there was no harm in exaggerating. Stories a little, after all. Everyone did the same. But as his power grew, so did the need to sustain the web of lies he began to build, without ever stopping to think about the consequences. The first lie Vitor told was about his past. He invented a story that portrayed him as a local hero, someone who had overcome great hardships to get to where he was. To his surprise, people believed him. He began to tell this story in all his speeches, using his supposed humble origins as a symbol of his dedication to the people. People began to see him in a different light, and that, for Vitor, was a turning point. The recognition and acceptance he gained from lying became more valuable than the truth. The sense of power he felt when he saw people admiring him made him lie more, to create more elaborate and convincing stories. He knew that if he kept his lies small, no one would question his words. However, as Victor soon realized, small lies were not enough to keep him on top. He began to invent even bigger facts, spreading rumors about his competitors, creating false alliances, and making promises he knew he would never keep. He manipulated the public, using his words to target people's pain points, offering simplistic solutions to complex problems. The game of lies became more complex by the day, and Victor felt invincible. He believed that the more he lied, the more powerful he became, and that no one would ever find out the truth. After all, he had always known that people would rather believe a lie that made them feel good than face the harsh reality. But over time, the lies began to pile up. Victor had to create new stories to cover the holes in his previous lies. He found himself trapped in a maze of deception, where every word he spoke had to be backed up by an even bigger lie. The weight of the manipulation began to affect him in unexpected ways. He could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was fabricated. Memories of his life, which had once been clear, began to blur with the stories he had made up. He found himself in a dilemma: keep spreading more lies and risk people starting to see through them, or start facing the truth, which would mean the end of his reign. But Victor had already crossed a line from which he could not return. Vitor no longer knew who he really was. The man who had begun his political career with good intentions had lost his way, consumed by the power of lies. He knew he was at a point of no return, but his obsession with controlling the narrative prevented him from backing down. He manipulated everything around him: the press, his allies, his enemies. Everything became a piece in a grand game, in which he was the strategist. Every lie he created, every distorted information he spread, gave him more power, more control. He no longer cared about the truth. What mattered was the perception people had of him. The turning point began when one of Vitor's oldest lies began to be questioned. Years ago, he had claimed that he had been responsible for a major reform that benefited thousands of people. But a thorough investigation revealed that, in fact, he had had no real involvement in it. People began to suspect, but instead of admitting his mistake, Vitor reacted as he always did. He spread more lies, accusing political opponents of spreading fake news and trying to discredit anyone who questioned him. He knew that if he maintained the appearance of trust, people would still believe him. But this time, the lie was starting to crumble. Vitor found himself increasingly surrounded. The misinformation he had spread for years began to backfire on him. The media, which had previously applauded him, now began to investigate his actions more deeply. The allies he had bought with empty promises began to distance themselves, realizing that the basis of his alliances was built on falsehoods. Sylvia, a journalist who had been a great defender of Vitor, began to investigate his life and his actions. She found inconsistencies, veiled lies in every public statement he made. When she published an article that debunked his main campaign promise, the reaction was immediate. Society, previously enchanted by his image, began to openly question him. The power he had gained through lies was about to be undone. However, Vitor did not give up. In a fiery speech, he accused the journalist of being part of a conspiracy and used his manipulative words to turn the situation in his favor. But the truth was spreading. and the more attentive began to see through the game. With each passing day, Vitor's lies seemed more fragile. What had once been a solid narrative, built over years of manipulation, was now crumbling like a house of cards. He had created a web of deceit so complex that not even he could hold it together. The revelations began to spread like wildfire, and Vitor realized belatedly that he had crossed the line. His lies had gotten out of hand, and the truth was finally being revealed. As more people began to question Victor, he found his power slipping through his fingers. His once blind and unconditional support began to waver. The lies he had created to manipulate and gain trust were now being dismantled, one by one. But he was not about to admit defeat. Anxiety consumed him as he tried desperately to find a way to turn the tide again. He isolated himself from his advisors, his closest allies, and began to attack his opponents even more aggressively. He did not want to be exposed. The fear of losing control drove him to create even more lies, more false stories to distort the reality around him. Meanwhile, Sylvia, the journalist who had challenged Vitor, continued her investigation, with more evidence of his lies piling up. She realized that she was dealing with someone who was not only lying, but who had orchestrated an entire narrative to deceive society. It was no longer just a matter of fact-checking. She was unmasking a ruthless manipulator who had used disinformation as his greatest weapon. Sylvia's report gained traction, and social media began to fill with discussions about Vitor's lies. Images of a corrupt and manipulative politician began to spread rapidly. Disillusionment took hold of all those who had previously seen Vitor as a trustworthy figure. But what Vitor didn't know was that his own manipulation had created a monster that he could no longer control. He tried to deny the accusations with even more lies, but now people were beginning to realize the fallacy of everything he said. Deep down, he knew that his lies had become the pillar of his existence, but he also knew that sooner or later the truth would come out. The problem was that he was so deeply immersed in his own web of deceit that he could no longer free himself from it. Vitor was at the point of no return. His lies had already created a reality of their own that he could not deny. Finally, Victor had to face the consequences of his actions. Official investigation was opened, and a series of documents that he believed had been hidden began to be exposed. He was confronted with irrefutable evidence of his manipulation, of how much he had lied and manipulated the masses to achieve power. People who had previously seen him as a hero now saw him as the villain in a story of his own making. Victor realized too late that lying as a weapon has a very high price. He went from being a leader of the masses to an isolated man, without power, without allies, and most importantly, without trust. The lies he had spread backfired on him in devastating ways, and the empire he had built on disinformation began to crumble. When Victor realized that his empire of lies was crumbling, he tried to play his last card. He publicly recanted, trying to convince people that he was being unfairly persecuted. But the public, who had previously trusted his words, had already seen the holes in his story. The trust he had cultivated with his lies had been eroded, and what had once been a path to power had become a free fall into public humiliation. Despite his desperate attempts at manipulation, the truth spread like wildfire. Now, everyone saw Victor for the true face he had tried to hide. The question that arose, however, was how he had managed to deceive so many people for so long. The power of misinformation seemed so strong that people found themselves blind to reality, often preferring to believe the lies that fit their beliefs. As the investigation deepened, new evidence began to emerge. A growing number of Vitor's allies, once loyal to the end, began to distance themselves from his circle, fearing that they would be dragged into the storm of accusations. Some began to reveal what they knew, confirming Vitor's manipulations and how he used lies to create his own reality. His lawyers began to abandon the defense, knowing that the case was untenable. Within weeks, what had seemed like an impenetrable shield of power and lies crumbled. Vitor's popularity was quickly replaced by public loathing. His empire of lies was in ruins, and he suddenly found himself vulnerable, being hunted by the consequences of his own actions. While social media was saturated with discussions about how much Vitor had manipulated the truth, he tried desperately to stay relevant, creating speeches and videos trying to restore his image. But it was too late. His speeches sounded empty. his words weightless, and his promises seemed like echoes of a past that no one believed in anymore. The media, which had once idolized him, now exposed him with every mistake, with every lie that was discovered. Vitor realized, with bitterness, that he had fallen victim to the same tool he had used to gain his position. Lies. His own manipulation had trapped him, and like a cornered beast, he became increasingly desperate. He had stopped being a political leader and had become a fugitive from the very words he had created. The big blow came when Sylvia, the journalist who had begun to unmask him, revealed internal documents that proved that Vitor had manipulated, falsified, and even forged alliances with other politicians and businessmen to ensure his rise to power. It was no longer a simple lie here and there, but a complete scheme of corruption, disinformation, and manipulation of the masses. Vitor had played with the truth to create an empire that was now collapsing before his eyes. Public indignation took over the streets, and demonstrations began to grow in several cities, demanding justice. Vitor had fallen from his pedestal, but now he found himself facing something he could never have foreseen: the revolt of a deceived people. With Vitor's downfall, society began to reflect on the dangers of manipulation and misinformation. Public trust would never be the same. The institutions that had been corrupted by him began to reevaluate their policies, and a growing movement for transparency and truth began to take shape. Sylvia, who had initially been a lone voice, became a central figure in the fight against misinformation, and her investigation brought to light not only Vitor's lies, but the system that allowed him to spread them unchallenged. The fight for a more honest and fair system was now at a crucial point, and people began to organize around the idea that truth and transparency needed to be the foundations of society. Vitor was removed from all his duties, but the impact of his actions remained. He became a symbol of how deceit can corrode the foundations of a society. The press, which had previously glorified him, now ridiculed him. Social media was full of memes, satire, and discussions about the manipulation he had caused. But what hurt him the most was the realization that he had lost the only thing that really mattered: people's trust. The lie, which he had previously used as a sharp weapon, was now turned against him, making him a political pariah. Vitor tried to hide from the pressure, taking refuge in a series of interviews where he tried to explain his actions, but his image was irreparably tarnished. The truth, however, was more complex than simply unmasking Vitor. What his rise and fall revealed was a power structure corrupted by disinformation, a web of lies that had been built over years. Many of his allies were dragged into the scandal, and some of the country's biggest political figures were also exposed as complicit. Although Vitor was the most visible face of the manipulation, he was not the only one responsible. Disinformation had infiltrated every level of society, and now everyone was trying to deal with the consequences of their own omissions and mistakes. Sylvia, realizing the scale of the problem, began to question the effectiveness of the media in combating disinformation, and she found herself facing a new struggle: how to prevent this from happening again. As Vitor's trial approached, he tried again to make himself heard, but this time, his lies had no more power over public opinion. He was isolated, without allies, and the public had grown tired of his excuses. Vitor began to realize that lying as a weapon was not a permanent solution. What he had considered a tool to achieve power was, in fact, a destructive force that had ended up consuming everything around him. And now, with no one to support him, he faced the consequences of his actions. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and his once unbeatable image was now irreparably shattered. In court, Victor was finally confronted with the full extent of the lies he had created. Every one of his manipulations was exposed, and every forged document was presented as evidence of his fraud. He tried to defend himself, but no words could save him. He knew deep down that no matter how hard he tried to justify himself, what he had done could not be erased. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, and the audience, who had previously felt deceived by his words, now looked at him with contempt. The truth, which he had spent so long trying to hide, had finally come to light, and he was convicted of corruption, fraud, and manipulation. His sentence was severe, and he found himself for the first time powerless. Victor was now a shadow of the man he had once been, and his empire of lies crumbled before him. After the conviction, society began to rebuild lost trust. Sylvia, who was instrumental in exposing Viter's lies, became a tireless advocate for the integrity of information. She worked to create a transparency network where journalists and ordinary citizens could collaborate to combat disinformation. The lesson that society learned was profound. The truth should not be something that can be manipulated to gain power. Freedom of expression and access to information became even more valuable rights, and the responsibility of each individual to ensure that the truth is preserved became a priority in many sectors of society. Viter spent his remaining days reflecting on his choices, but he knew he could never go back. The consequences of his actions had stripped him of everything he once valued. The lie he had used to elevate himself had ended up destroying everything around him: his power, his reputation, his allies, and his very freedom. He had no one left to blame but himself. In his loneliest moments, he wondered if it was worth trying to regain any semblance of dignity, but he knew there was no going back. The weight of the manipulation he had caused would be something he would carry forever, like a scar that would never heal. As time went on, Victor's story became a warning to those who would try to follow in his footsteps. His downfall was studied as an example of how lies can be used to gain power, but also of how these lies can destroy everything a person has built. Society, now more vigilant, became increasingly resistant to manipulation. Lies, once its greatest weapon, were now seen as the poison that corrupts the souls of those who dare to use them. Victor's legacy, far from being that of a hero, became that of a warning. No one, no matter how brilliant, can escape the consequences of the lies they spread.